Dr. Hennessy, as you see, there is Associate Professor of History, that is History of Science and Environmental Studies. It's a fascinating combination. She is a geographer who works at the intersection of environmental history, political ecology, science, and technology studies, and has been looking at, with a special focus on Latin America. This, which she's talking about today, is her first book, On the Backs of Tortoises. And then the subtitle that you see there is Darwin, the Galapagos, and the Fate of an Evolutionary Eden. It was published by the Yale University Press in 2019, and it was longlisted for a 2020 Penn/E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Any updates on that listing, Elizabeth?
I was a finalist, but didn't win, actually.
Oh, well, you were a finalist. Good for you. The book draws on ethnographic and archival research to trace a transnational history of the iconic Galapagos giant tortoise as an animal at the center of tensions among evolutionary science, conservation, and tourism development in the archipelago. She's currently focusing now on palm oil industry in Ecuador, and I imagine that you can look into, rely on some of the many trips that you've taken down to Ecuador for that. There's a bud rot disease, which is reconfiguring local economies there. And if you would like to share with us any new ideas on palm oil and what significance they have on our lives, we'd be happy to learn from that too, if you have time, Elizabeth. So it's now a couple of minutes after 10, and we'll give Elizabeth the podium and look forward to your thoughts. Thank you very much for coming, Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for the invitation and for everyone for attending this morning. And yeah, I am kind of delayed in the palm oil project right now because I'm not able to go to Ecuador to do the bulk of the research, but I can talk a little bit about that at the end if you ask questions.
Good.
So yeah, I have had the great fortune to work in the Galapagos Islands, focusing on the most iconic species there, the giant tortoises. I never expected to write a book about turtles, but when I first went to Galapagos as a grad student in 2007, I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to make sense of the place unless I took the tortoises seriously. They seem really to be everywhere in the islands. You can see hundreds of babies, there we go, on display at the breeding center. There are actually breeding centers on 3 different islands. They are plastered on billboards for tourism companies. They are in every souvenir shop. This is a t-shirt design from a while ago. They're used to advertise local products. They are painted in murals and schoolhouse walls, and they can even be found getting drunk down at the corner bar. But silly tortoise images aside, I'm going to ask you to put your herpetology hats on with me for a little bit this morning. As I started researching the history of the archipelago, the tortoises seemed to become ever more central. For centuries, the islands were known to explorers, buccaneers, and whalers who were sailing the Pacific as a storehouse of natural resources. They came for water, timber, and above all else, the tortoises, which were considered a most delicious source of fresh meat and fat. In the 16th century, Spanish sailors encountering the New World named the archipelago for its tastiest resources. So Galapago is actually an old Spanish word for tortoise. And today, of course, the hundreds of thousands of tourists who visit the islands, at least up until the pandemic last year, wouldn't dream of eating the tortoises. They're now seen as charismatic endangered species and icons of conservation in a place that's often called a natural laboratory of evolution. And that change, in part, is due to Charles Darwin. And I imagine you all know that Darwin visited the Galapagos in 1835 during the Beagle Voyage. And he was quite taken not only with the finches and the mockingbirds that he collected, but also with marine iguanas and the tortoises, which he wrote seemed to my fancy like some antediluvian animals. Now, all of this tortoise history evokes an old story that some of you may know. It's a story that I may begin the book with, and so I'm going to read it, my version of it, to set up my talk today. Now, I've heard this story many times now, and I think it's as likely to be legend as it is likely to be true. It supposedly took place in an auditorium or a university lecture hall in the early 20th century, where the philosopher William James, or maybe it was philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, stood before a crowded room giving a talk on recent theories of cosmology. At the end of the lecture, as members of the audience started asking questions, an elderly woman in the back made her way to the front of the room. When her turn to speak came, she declared, "Your talk was very interesting, Mr. James, but it's wrong. We all know that the Earth really rests on the back of a turtle." James raised his eyebrows, but nodded respectfully and replied, but then what does the turtle stand on?" And the old lady replied, "Well, that's easy. The turtle stands on the back of a second, far larger turtle." Amused, James persisted to see what might happen if he asked one more time. "Well, what does that second turtle stand on?" The old woman smiled and shook her head. "Very clever, Mr. James, but it's turtles all the way down." Every time I've heard that story, the teller interprets it slightly differently. How are we supposed to understand the old woman's claim that the world rests on the backs of turtles? What is it about that story that makes it such an often told tale? I think the old woman's insistence on the stack of turtles makes the story memorable, and for some it may be amusing, like something out of a Dr. Seuss story. But we laugh a little uneasily at the punchline because it invites us to doubt our own certainties. Do we really know that the old woman is wrong? In a number of non-Western cultures, turtles play foundational roles in origin stories. And in drawing a contrast between two ways of knowing the world, the story points to a deeper truth about the ground we stand on, the things that we take for granted without really knowing them to be true. Take, for instance, how the physicist Stephen Hawking interpreted the story to introduce his brief history of time. In a book that explains research on some of the most challenging contemporary questions about the nature of the universe, including the Big Bang and black holes, Hawking opens with the old woman and her turtles to remind readers that the basis for our knowledge of the cosmos may turn out to be not that much sturdier than her tower of turtles. "We may find her claim to be ridiculous," he writes, "but why do we think we know better? Our knowledge is uncertain," Hawking reminds us, "and always a work in progress. The ground on which we stand isn't as solid as we might like to imagine." The Turtles All the Way Down story is a tale, metaphor, but the book is about a real place where the old woman's claim rings true. In the Galapagos, the world as we know it rests not on the back of turtles, but I argue of giant tortoises. Now, I don't mean that anyone who lives in the Galapagos literally believes that the Earth or the islands rest on a pile of these enormous reptiles. What I mean is that the land-dwelling animals have fundamentally shaped the history of the archipelago. Galapagos just wouldn't be the same place without them. The tortoises are today charismatic icons of conservation, but they're much more than that. I've been visiting for more than a decade now, and the more I return, the more deeply I'm struck by the many different meanings that the tortoises carry. What it means to rest on their backs is far more complicated, ethically ambiguous, and fascinating than I could have imagined when I first stepped ashore. And much like Stephen Hawking's pondering of the implications of black holes for our understanding of time, I've learned that the Turtles All the Way Down history of the Galapagos is far less certain and straightforward than it appears. And so I will explain what I mean by that as I tell stories about some of these tortoises today. Sorry about that. Ahead of myself. And I'm going to focus first on a provocation, and that is this idea that the Galapagos have a tortoise problem. And I don't mean a problem with saving these endangered animals, which conservation has actually been very successful at doing, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But instead, I mean a problem with what the giant tortoises represent. So to explain, let me turn to another version of the Turtles All the Way Down story, this one told by the philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers. In a book that focuses on the power of scientific theories to modify society and the power of social thought to shape science, she uses the story to question the foundation of modern knowledge. She recounts much the same story as Hawking, asking whether there's much difference between the old lady's turtles and the fundamental laws of physics. Both theories posit a world that could, in principle, be fully explained. What differs are the elements of that explanation, be they an infinite stack of turtles or the quarks that physicists currently understand to be the fundamental building blocks of matter. Both reflect what philosophers call the turtle problem of infinite regress, a never-ending quest for solid ground. In the story, both the old woman and Hawking have us searching endlessly for an ever larger turtle or an ever smaller subatomic particle as the basis for knowledge. Well, the tortoise problem of conservation, I argue, is similar, a stubbornly enticing yet impossible desire to restore a world of prehistoric nature, to go back to Eden. What's at stake in saving the Galapagos is not only saving giant tortoises and other unique wildlife from extinction, it's also saving the foundational site of the secular scientific origin story, a biological and geological Eden. It's about saving the place that Darwin once wrote was the origin of all my views. As a BBC documentary series put it, these are the islands that changed the world, the place that changed our understanding of life on Earth. Since the mid-20th century, scientists have worked to conserve evolution in this natural laboratory. Well, Darwin never called the islands an Eden, though he might well have liked the metaphor, I think. He carried John Milton's story of Adam and Eve, Paradise Lost, with him whenever he went ashore from the Beagle. But the idea of an evolutionary Eden is a contradiction. Ironically, in trying to preserve the Galapagos as an Eden, conservation biologists have attempted to restore the very foundation of life that was shattered by Darwin's emphasis on evolutionary process all the way down. In the Galapagos, giant tortoises anchor conservationists' desire to restore the islands to a pre-human world. Their plodding, creaky gait, leathery skin, and worn armor certainly make them look the part of animals from a land before time. By many measures, conservationists have been quite successful at saving this place. To conserve evolution in a place often considered one of the last bastions of pristine nature, biologists have sought to protect the island's historical isolation. Conservationists estimate the islands retain 95% of their original or pre-1535 endemic biodiversity. That's a really impressive statistic, a much higher rate of surviving endemic species than in Hawaii, for example. Galapagos is among the world's most striking conservation success stories. But despite all the good that conservation has achieved, its way of trying to save life will never bring back Eden. Evolution, as conservation biologists well know, cannot be rewound. And as the tortoise's own histories make clear, the islands are far from pristine. But more significant than that, their stories call into question the way of thinking about nature that they suggested the islands even could be pristine. So in telling a couple of tortoise stories today, I want to explore two central questions. First, why has this idea that the archipelago is a natural laboratory of evolution come to guide conservation in the first place? And then what have been the effects of that vision? The book argues that restoring an evolutionary Eden is something of a red herring, and instead the work of conservation is really about the entanglement of humans and non-humans all the way down. There's really no way of separating a place of nature and a place of culture. But before I get into my tortoise stories, I will talk a little bit about my methods today. So this is some shots of my research sites. In the upper left, I am in the archives of the British Museum of Natural History. Below that, the tortoise, the taxidermy tortoise, is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The upper right, I am following Freddie Cabrera, who is an ecologist in the Galapagos, and he has in his hand, you can't really see it, a radio telemetry monitor, an antenna, and the tortoise in front of him has a GPS unit on his carapace. And so you can track the tortoise's migration up and down the slopes of these dormant volcanoes. And then the bottom right picture, I'm on the left in the green shirt, and we are scrubbing the little wading pool of a giant tortoise named Lonesome George, who was in the background. That was back in 2011 when George was still alive. And the man in the red hat on the right is Fausto Urena, who is he's retired now, but for more than 30 years was the keeper of this tortoise breeding center on Santa Cruz Island, where I volunteered for about a month.
Elizabeth, could I ask you a question at this
Sure.
point? You raised two questions, but you went through them kind of fast, and I wondered if you would mind to repeat them. Could you do that for us so we could really take note of these questions? That would help us a lot to appreciate the comments.
Sure. So the first was, why has the idea that the archipelago is a natural laboratory of evolution? Like, where does that idea come from, and why has it been the guide for conservation? And then what have been the effects of that particular vision for conservation?
What are the effects of
thinking about basing conservation on the idea that the islands are a natural laboratory?
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So I did what I refer to as mixed methods research, which is part ethnographic. So basically talking to people, scientists, conservationists, folks who just live in the Galapagos and work in tourism and farming, a lot of different industries for government. And then I also did participant observation, which means that I was participating in some of these ecology projects and working as a volunteer at the breeding center. I also did archival research in all of these archives that you can see listed here, several natural history museums, the UNESCO archives, the Zoological Society of London, and then several archives in the Galapagos and in Ecuador as well. And then a little orientation to Galapagos as well. So this is a map of the archipelago, and you can see there are 13 large islands, which were once home to 15 different species of giant tortoises. Now, 4 of those species went extinct because of predation by sailors and island colonists. At least until we thought so until recently. You might have seen last year there was an Animal Planet expedition that went to the westernmost island of Fernandina, and they turned up 1 female tortoise on the island. It was the first tortoise that had been seen on that island in 115 years. And so the species previously thought to be extinct, actually, it turns out, is not quite yet extinct. The dark gray islands on this map are islands that have extant or existing tortoise species. The lighter gray islands are places where the tortoises have gone extinct. And so that includes Floriana in the south, Santa Fe, and Pinta, which is where Lonesome George was from. But I'm going to tell you today about the tortoises from Santiago Island here in the middle of the archipelago. Now these are called Darwini, Chelonoidis darwini, named for our friend Charles Darwin, of course. And they were named in 1907 by the curator of herpetology at the California Academy of Sciences, a man named John Vandenberg. And Vandenberg wanted to memorialize Darwin with his species name. And scientists often name species after friends, after colleagues, or important predecessors. And the Santiago Island tortoises are one of many things that are named for Darwin in the Galapagos today. There is a research station, a couple streets. I've met several young boys whose names are Darwin. And if you've been to the Galapagos, you know that Darwin is heroized in the archipelago. It's kind of a patron saint of science and conservation. You run into him everywhere, it seems. Here he is on an arch that's very close to the entrance to the national park on Santa Cruz Island. You can't quite make out his godlike face up at the top of the arch. He is looking down over Galapagos creatures. I have also seen him in his office, so to speak, at the Charles Darwin Research Station and also out front of a cafe. But these images of Darwin, they often always show him really as the graybeard Darwin, right? So the old sage who crafted the concept of evolution. But that Darwin is actually a far cry from the young man who visited the archipelago. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Darwin's experience on Santiago Island. That was what inspired Vandenberg to name those tortoises for him. So on a sunny day in October of 1835, a 26-year-old Darwin hiked from the parched coast of Santiago to the island's green, damp highlands, where he was taken with the giant tortoises that he found. After a long walk, he sat in the shade and watched them as they ambled along broad roads that had been trodden by their elephant-like feet over countless generations. He timed their gait faster than he supposed, measured their carapaces, 6 and 8 feet in circumference, and tried to lift them, some way well over 500 pounds. Finding their weight too much, he climbed aboard, wrapping them in their shells and trying not to slip off their backs as they trudged along. Riding tortoises is today, of course, not among the approved ways of following in Darwin's footsteps in the Galapagos. Tourists may observe the animals that Darwin saw, but they're not permitted to do as he did. Recreating the experiences of the Darwin who actually walked the islands would mean doing a host of things that are now prohibited by national park rules. Trying to net birds with your hat or catching iguanas by the tail and dissecting their stomachs to see what they eat. But perhaps worst of all would be doing what Darwin did after a day spent observing the tortoises, feasting on them. In the highlands of Santiago, Darwin spent 2 days camping with local tortoise hunters, during which time he subsisted on nothing but the animals. The Spaniard hunters, as Darwin called them, were actually political exiles from the new state of Ecuador who were collecting meat for a colony on another island. For dinner, they made tortoise carne con cuero in the style of Argentinian gauchos, roasting the meat on the breastplate and frying it in tortoise fat. Jotting down his impression of the meal afterward, Darwin deemed it to be very good, although he preferred the capital soup made of young tortoises. This young Darwin would be abhorred by the supposedly conservationist graybeard Darwin who watches over the islands. But even as an old man, Darwin didn't see the Galapagos through the eyes of an environmentalist intent on protecting nature. So Darwin ate these tortoises that are now named for him. But Vandenberg, of course, didn't mention that part of the story when he described why he wanted to name these tortoises after Darwin. He just included Darwin's natural history observations. And I wanted to tell that story because it was Vandenberg who published the first monograph, this was back in 1914, that established that there had been 15 different species of giant tortoises, or he called them races at the time. Now, when Darwin was in the Galapagos, both the vice governor of the Floriana colony, where those tortoise hunters had come from, and the tortoise hunters themselves told Darwin that they could tell what island a tortoise came from just because they all looked slightly different. Now, in retrospect, this was a giant hint about evolution, but Darwin wrote that he regretted not paying much attention to it at the time. And so unlike the finches and the mockingbirds, he didn't collect tortoises as natural history specimens. The Beagle only took them aboard as food. It was Vandenberg's monograph that vindicated what the colonists and what Darwin thought to be true, that each island had a different tortoise species. And the specimen you can see on the slide here, 8109, that's the type specimen from Santiago that is stored in a back room at the Cal Academy today. And it's the animal that Vandenberg measured and described when he named the species. Vandenberg was the first to write about the tortoise's survival status as well. And he named them as from extinct, like the species like on Floriana Island, to rare, like those on Santiago, to others that were abundant on southern Isabella Island. Up to this point, scientists had mainly tried to save tortoises by collecting them for museums and taxidermying specimens. But Vandenberg's monograph was a turning point for the animals because it was in the 1920s and 1930s that scientists first began to campaign to try and establish a national park in the Galapagos, and more emphasis was put on trying to save living animals. And so this emphasis on trying to save the Galapagos as a natural laboratory emerges out of this period in the 1930s. So following an expedition from the Cal Academy in 1932, an ornithologist named Harry Swarth called on Ecuador to create an outdoor biological laboratory in the archipelago, which he argued was one of the most amazing natural laboratories of evolutionary processes on Earth. Now, the idea of the Galapagos as a natural laboratory suggests a remote, isolated, and controlled space where scientists would have access to the last remnants of pristine nature and could study unimpeded natural processes. For biologists, the metaphor was not an oxymoron that juxtaposed the unruliness of wildlife with the enclosed sterility of more traditional sites of scientific experiment. Rather, it reflected the scientific value of the archipelago as a place where nature ran experiments in evolution. The Galapagos provided a unique landscape for field-based study where the simplicity of life on stark and scarcely populated volcanoes helped to make processes of evolution visible. The islands were an exceptional place where biologists could actually study evolution in situ. The giant tortoises were central objects of this laboratory world, as were other native species, including the finches, penguins, flamingos, albatross, and flightless cormorants. For biologists, protecting these animals within a nature reserve was the only way to preserve the utility of the natural laboratory for scientific study. Rather than collect specimens from museums or zoos, for this next generation of field biologists, place-based conservation was crucial. When foreign naturalists used the natural laboratory metaphor, they were arguing not just for the importance of their own field work, but also for a specific vision for protecting the islands. Their ideas reflected a romanticized view of pristine wilderness that was central to the creation of US national parks, as well as European models of parks created explicitly for scientific use. Now, the rest of the chapter that I was just reading from goes on to detail how between the 1930s and about 1960, a group of mostly US and European scientists campaigned through UNESCO and through the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources to create this Charles Darwin Research Station and the Galapagos National Park. Both of those institutions were founded in 1959, at least on paper. As you can see here, this is the very first building of the Charles Darwin Research Station that was inaugurated in 1964. And my research has shown this to be a neocolonial endeavor that was led in part by scientists who had been working in the Belgian Congo, who moved to focus on Galapagos during a period when African nations became independent, and many European scientists were afraid of losing access to the tropical places where they did their research. So white foreign scientists justified their intervention in the Galapagos through an environmental white savior narrative, one that's probably familiar, that they knew better how to see the true value of the archipelago and how to protect it than the Ecuadorians did. They saw Ecuadorians as mismanaging the islands and allowing for exploitation of their fauna. And the Galapagos, what this meant was that it was mostly white foreigners who were initially interested in conservation, although with some notable exceptions. And that had impacts for the kind of conservation that was imagined. And protecting the natural laboratory became the dominant framework. And that meant protecting an isolated space of nature as much as possible. So at the time in the 1960s, only about 2,000 people actually lived in the archipelago. They lived in pretty small villages and subsisted on fishing and hunting feral goats and cattle for the most part. Ecuadorian scientists who were involved in conservation efforts saw the situation slightly differently than foreign conservationists had. One was named Misael Acosta Solis, who was the most prominent Ecuadorian conservationist of the day, who was instrumental in establishing the nation's first Institute of Forestry. And he had a vision much closer to what we would call sustainable development today. On uninhabited islands, he thought that establishing strict reserves worthy of protecting a living museum of nature was a good idea. But on islands where people already lived, protection, he thought, couldn't be as strict because people relied on agriculture and fishing. And so this led to a division of the archipelago into 97% national park and 3% allocated to where people live, so urban and agricultural zones. And that division from the 1960s exists still today in the Galapagos. So another Ecuadorian named Cristobal Bonifaz thought that scientific research should help develop the island's fishing industry and support the developing economy. But the foreign scientists were nearly all opposed to this idea of science for development and this natural laboratory. They really wanted to protect the islands from any kind of development. And so that's what the natural laboratory idea came to mean in terms of conservation. And it set up a really interesting and unique goal for conservation in the Galapagos too, which is actually conserving evolutionary processes. And so this becomes the focus of another one of the chapters in the book, which is how does one save evolution, actually? This is a really unique goal. And one conservation biologist I asked said the goal of conserving Galapagos was to maintain evolutionary processes in an unaltered state. She wanted to, quote, conserve the real Galapagos, an evolutionary laboratory, which involved maintaining evolutionary processes, pristine ecosystems, and species. For another scientist, this translated into work that aimed to protect the unique creatures that have evolved in the Galapagos so they might continue to do so in a changing world. And that second interpretation, I think the majority of his colleagues and the public would support. But that wasn't exactly how a group of 58 Galapagos-based international conservation biologists summarized their biodiversity vision for the archipelago at the turn of the 20th century. For them, the goal was to, quote, go back to Eden by restoring the islands to their condition in 1534, the year before the islands were first discovered by the Spanish. And so they raised the question of really not just conserving evolution, but whether it were possible to restore evolution. As a goal for conservation, restoring an evolutionary Eden seems to be a paradoxical objective, considering that Darwin taught us that life is always moving forward and never backward. He made it clear, as philosopher Elizabeth Groves reminds us, that time, along with life itself, always moves forward and becomes rather more than less complex. Why has such then an un-Darwinian goal so captivated conservationists? Is it possible to conserve the process of evolution in a world where isolation is a thing of the past? So this chapter explains what happens when conservationists have tried to restore evolution. And I think there are twin strategies that go into this idea of conserving and restoring evolution. On the one hand, on the bottom of the slide, you have strategies that are focused around making live endangered species like the tortoises. There are other breeding programs and other projects for other kinds of species too. But in the case of tortoises, we are breeding all of these endangered species and populations to help grow the population numbers. But then on the other hand, on the top part of this slide is this parallel strategy of making die or killing off introduced species and invasive species, particularly goats. And so I will talk a little bit about each of these strategies. So first, making live, the breeding, the happy stories. When you go to Galapagos as a tourist, most tours include a stop at one of the 3 breeding centers on the islands. These centers were started in 1965, and park guards who were really worried about the few remaining tortoises on some of the islands. In the case of Hispaniola Island, it was a really small island. They only found 14 animals, and they brought them all into captivity because they were afraid that their animals were so few that they just wouldn't even find each other on this island in order to breed. And so they wanted to try and facilitate breeding. And over the last 60 years, this project has been incredibly successful. There are now something like 200 or 300 adult tortoises living in captivity and breeding, and they have produced more than 10,000 offspring over the last 60 years. And those offspring, you can see them, the little tortoises here, when they are about 5 years old, are then repatriated to their home islands to live in the wild again. And they wait until they're about 5 years old because at that age, they are big enough to withstand predation by rats that prey on juvenile tortoises. And so this is a little bit to explain the process of what goes on in the breeding centers. Up in the upper left, you can see Don Fausto Llerena, who is the park guard who has run the Central Breeding Center, or ran it for about 35 years. And he is loading tortoise food onto a wheelbarrow. Those are kind of elephant ear plant. They're called a toy in Spanish. The tortoises are fed those 3 times a week. And then in the bottom left hand, you can see Don Fausto in the red hat and another park guard in the green hat. And they are excavating a tortoise nest. And so in the captive spaces, the female and male tortoises live together, and then the females, when they are impregnated, will dig out nests for their eggs in these kind of soft, sandy soils, and they will deposit their eggs, and then they build back this cap over the top and urinate on it to kind of make the dirt really solid and muddy. And then shortly after that happens, the park guards will go dig out these eggs and really carefully mark them and transport them to an incubator. So they will be incubated for several months before they hatch. And that is to increase the numbers of each egg from a nest that would hatch. Usually not all of the eggs in a nest will actually hatch. And so that's how they have been so successful over the last 60 years. There are estimates that there used to be up to 300,000 giant tortoises living in the Galapagos, and that number was reduced tenfold to about 25,000, 30,000 through predation by whalers, buccaneers, and island colonists. And so today the numbers are probably back up to around 40,000. It's slow going, but park guards and scientists are really confident that the animals that they have repatriated to their home islands, these juvenile tortoises, About half of them survive. And that sounds kind of dismal, but it's actually a really good rate of survival for reintroduced animals. And that those, because they've been going on for so long, now some of those repatriated tortoises have already bred in situ and are repopulating islands in the wild. So this has been a really successful project. On the other side of this strategy, though, what you don't see when you go on vacation to the Galapagos and what is not really put up for public view is the process of eradication of introduced and invasive species. And so this is a slide. You can see tortoise goat competition was a really big problem in the Galapagos, and goat populations have been in the archipelago for hundreds of years, and they reproduce really quickly like bunnies, right? And so these goat populations would take off and they eat a lot of vegetation. And so what you're seeing here are trees and landscapes that are really been picked clean. And this is a problem for the tortoises because the goats are out competing them for this limited vegetation. So I want to tell you a little bit more about this goat eradication project. First, hunting has always been a central line of conservation work, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize about conservation. One of the very first park guards who started working at the national park in 1968 told me that hunting was our profession. That was it, to kill animals. Now, he had been educated at an FAO forestry school, and so when he came out to Galapagos to start working, hunting was not what he was expecting to do. He thought he was going to be doing sustainable forestry management. But for decades, from the 1960s to the 1990s, teams of 3 to 5 park guards would live on remote islands with a team of dogs, and they would hunt goats and wild boar. And the goats in particular were a problem because they could reproduce so quickly. And so these men would go out and just kill as many of these goats and wild boar as they could in about a 3-week period. Another park guard who was in charge of restoration told me that by the late 1990s, he knew that this hunting method wasn't working though, because every month they would kill 3,000 or 4,000 goats, but they would move on to another island. But when it came time to cycle back to that first island, he said it was like nothing had happened and the goats had all repopulated. And so he knew that conservationists needed a new strategy. And so they looked to New Zealand, where similar concerns about protecting native island fauna from invasion had led to the development of specialist conservation hunting. So there, sharpshooters hunted from helicopters using Judas animals collared with radio transmitters to track their prey. So they held an international workshop and an exploratory trip that persuaded conservationists that this was the model they should follow in Galapagos if they ever wanted to clean the islands of unwanted animals. As one conservation biologist explained to me, island eradication campaigns require the death of every last introduced animal because failing to find even one pregnant female goat means that the population could regenerate. And so they put together funding for this. They actually got $50 million worth of funding from the Global Environmental Facility for a project that they called Control of Invasive Species in the Galapagos, or otherwise known locally as a Total Control Plan for Permanent Control of Invasive Species. And that included a big push eradication hunting campaign. It also included institutional capacity building, quarantine systems to prevent future introductions as well. Well, the core of the project ran from 1998 to 2006 and focused primarily on eradicating the goats on Santiago and Isabella. The one project leader framed this conservationist selection in biblical terms, writing, "We're rather like a collective Noah, deciding with a biblical coldness which life forms will be able to accompany us on our new journey in the ark." Now, this flood was to wash the islands in a deluge of bloodshed and goat carcasses. It was a big budget, high modern hunt of epic proportion. 60 local hunters were trained in precision hunting and used automatic rifles for ground and air campaigns with helicopters to speed the process and allow access to difficult terrain. The arsenal for this assault included 22 caliber rifles, exploding bullets, telescopic sights, global positioning systems, two-way radios, nylon nets, and 1 million rounds of ammunition imported from the United States, an order that apparently prompted a quick phone call from the US State Department. They were apparently concerned about the prospect of an armed insurgency in this Latin American state. And to locate these really difficult to reach populations, the Galapagos team hunted out of helicopters often, and they also used what they call Judas goats tagged with radio telemetry devices to lead hunters to a group of animals. And so you can see on the left, that big orange collar is the radio telemetry collar, and that's a Judas goat that was used to track. And so the idea is that as Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, tracker animals betray their kin by helping hunters locate herds to kill. The method, as one conservationist wrote, exploits the gregarious nature of goats, leveraging their sociality as a lure. Hunters argue that the use of Judas animals allows for more humane killing because of the speed that it facilitates. But even if Judas hunting might be more humane for the targeted goats, it's certainly not for the Judas animals themselves, who repeatedly see their packs killed. The Judas work also exploits the animal's reproductive biology. In addition to collaring goats with telemetry trackers and tagging them in red paint, conservationists also sterilized these Judas goats because pregnancy made these female Judas goats ineffective work animals. And instead of seeking out new reproductive partners, finding new herds, expectant mothers added to the populations they were supposed to help eliminate, and they spent time away from herds to give birth and care for their young. Now, traditionally, hunters would shoot newborn kids to encourage the Judas mothers to seek out a new pack. But one of the Galapagos project leaders, an Australian conservation biologist named Carl Campbell, actually did his dissertation research on how to improve the efficiency of Judas goats. The ideal goats would be sterilized, but in a way that didn't negatively affect their sociability as castration did for males. And so Campbell tested different methods that would retain the animal's sexual motivation while preventing reproduction. And the more sex, he wrote, the better. Nymphomaniac behavior would be desirable in Judas goat operations, he wrote, but it's unknown how to introduce this condition. Through his experiments on female goats, though, he developed a new model of Judas goats that were put into prolonged estrus with hormone implants. And they called them Mata Hari goats, named after the Dutch courtesan who spied for Germany during World War I. They would continue to attract males without ever becoming impregnated. So Campbell's solution to this conservation problem folded the biological cause of the goat's invasive force to work in hunters' favor. Now, this project, aiming for total control over nature, has been construed as a major success in the world of island conservation, demonstrating the feasibility of large-scale eradication programs. Hunters used 800 Judas goats to kill 152,000 of their kin on Isabella and Santiago. And you can see all the different hunting methods here. And on the map of Santiago, all these little tiny blue dots are kill events. And so they took a GPS tracker and actually geolocated every one of the individual kills so they could see where the goats had been hanging out, but also to track their productivity, the productivity of hunters. This presents a technocratic, economized view of death that was presented in project reports, puts the focus of killing on efficiency and deflects it from ethical and political issues. In my interviews, particularly with residents on Isabella Island, where community relationships with the national park have long been contentious, residents challenged the project from multiple perspectives. Some took issue with the idea of eradication because goat meat is a dietary staple in Ecuador and local people depended on the animals. Now, conservationists didn't actually target domestically kept goats. The locals thought that feral populations should be usefully rather than categorically killed. They found goat eradication to be wasteful because of the wasted meat. Indeed, all the carcasses on these islands were left in place That is largely because of logistical reasons of, these are remote volcanoes, and to be able to move the carcasses out would have been enormously expensive. But locals blame this for wasted meat, wasted opportunity to employ more local hunters, and wasted resources they thought should have been on other causes, such as clean water, which is a continual problem in the Galapagos. Local resentment of the project went beyond utility. In a place where residents have long defended their right to live in the islands, some charged the conservationists wanted to eradicate human residents as well as the goats, that the helicopters that were buzzing over town were actually threatening the residents themselves. Now, the conservationists I interviewed, of course, denied that this was true, and I believe them. But you can see the kind of local animosity that builds up around these kinds of projects. So the after effects of goat eradication also call into question the political and ecological feasibility of restoring an evolutionary Eden. So project reports show these triumphant photographs of vegetation rebounding on Santiago, and studies have also shown that Galapagos rail and hawk populations are also rebounding. But also necessary, it became clear, was better understanding of the role that goats had come to play in island ecosystems during the hundreds of years that they were present on the islands. We know that they denuded landscapes, but what became apparent after the eradication was just how much they also held in check introduced plant species, particularly blackberry. As you know, blackberry grows in really dense thickets. They're a really pernicious problem in agricultural highlands of several islands. And so these kind of ecological problems, as well as political responses, also threaten the long-term success of eradication. So shortly after this Project Isabella, this big eradication push ended, someone introduced 6 new goats to Santiago Island, out of spite, we assume. Another goat soon appeared on Darwin Island, which is really far out in the northwest corner of the archipelago. And park wardens were able to find and kill these goats. It cost them a lot, about $5,000 each for each goat. But the reintroductions demonstrate that eradication is a contingent achievement that's always susceptible to these kind of acts of defiance. So Galapagos residents have multiple grounds for criticizing goat eradication, but their experience nonetheless invokes a shared history with goats and other island species. And that history is discounted in conservationist logics that judge what belongs in the islands according to what evolved there. Eradication campaigns depend on a reductive understanding of ecology that focuses on a few key species and an idealized view of a past state of nature. The presumption is that either tortoises or goats, but not both, can and should survive. But as environmental philosopher Tom Van Doren argues, no matter how much and how many we kill, our goal cannot be to put things back how they once were. Rather, we're killing to produce valued natures. But such values aren't universally held. Goals of total eradication eclipse thorny political questions about how different groups value nature. And as goat reintroductions warn, such elisions have consequences. Conservation needs a broader frame for understanding the stakes and entanglements of eradication work that acknowledge multiple and conflicting ways of valuing nature. So to conclude briefly now, conservationists have worked really intensely over the past half century to protect evolution in this natural laboratory that is the Galapagos. And in many ways, their work has been remarkably successful. Today, some like 40,000 giant tortoises are thought to live in the wild and to reproduce in situ. And the eradication of goats and also rats has set a precedent of possibility for island conservation around the world. But this doesn't amount to restoring an evolutionary Eden. The language of restoration that's so prominent in conservation biology today, I think, is misleading. The choice is neither a return to an Edenic past nor an acceptance of a novel ecological state. Evolution, as conservationists well know, is far more complicated than that. Nature is always evolving and always novel. The idea of restoring evolution is born more of powerful conservationist imaginaries than of biological theory. It's an inherent contradiction that plays out as conservationists debate how best to protect endangered species in their island plant habitats. Acknowledging that evolution is always novel doesn't mean abandoning conservation either. It doesn't mean abandoning quarantine systems that attempt to protect the archipelago from new pests. But acknowledging that evolution is always novel does mean grappling with difficult questions instead of relying on a presumed Edenic baseline as the foundation on which conservation stands. It also means acknowledging that the closer one gets to nature, whether chasing goats or hacking away a blackberry, the better one sees how nature shifts and moves and exceeds human control. The simplified rhetoric of restoration is a political tool, a way of imagining conservation as if it were not active selection weighted with ethical valuations and assertions about who and what belongs in the archipelago, but rather the straightforward act of returning order to a messy world. There's not one real Galapagos to restore. Conservation cannot start from the premise that nature is or should be separate from human society. And tracking tortoise histories reveals the deep entanglements of natures and cultures and allows us to instead open up more difficult questions about what kinds of relationships should be conserved, by whom, and for whom. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
I would like to start off. I see some hands raised, so let me give some others a chance to start off. But I sure have a bunch of them for you, Elizabeth. It's a very provocative talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Let's see what we can do with. Two participants raised their hands, so let's see. I would like to unmute those who have their hands up. I see Dorothy has a hand up. Are you available to talk, Dorothy?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I think this is a very interesting talk because I, as a trained biologist, but not an environmental biologist, probably fall into the trap of wanting to return things to the pristine state. And so it's very useful to rethink that concept. And it's a very colonial kind of attitude to think that we should be removing people from an environment that's far from ours to return it to a good that we see. So I think I very much appreciate your talk. I don't actually have a specific question, but I just wanted to congratulate you on your insight.
Thank you, Dorothy. I think that's helpful.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, I think that, especially in the United States and Western Europe, even I grew up with this idea of pristine nature and conservation. And so it's been so dominant for so much of the 20th century that I think it's really natural that that's kind of your gut instinct. And I think it's really only in the last 30 years that has really been called into question, and that people are trying to think about okay, well, what could conservation be if it's not about the pristine, and it is about understanding that people are always part of these ecosystems, for better or worse, right? We do a lot of damage, but we really can't, there have been proposals to remove all the people from the Galapagos, which is complete political non-starter in Ecuador. It only pisses people off when people raise those kind of issues. But people have tried, outsiders really have tried to promote trying to find a buyer for the archipelago to buy it from the state so that it could be a solid conservation territory. But even then, tourism is still going to be an industry that wants to go. Conservation biologists themselves have to live in the island. So there's always going to be a human presence there.
Yeah. I think we have to be careful about using the word pristine, because if you think in terms of probably before Darwin, when whalers were leaving goats there intentionally, I don't call it returning the islands to pristine just to get rid of some goats that have gone wild and are not only defoliating some of the unneeded plants, but we're radically altering the whole vegetation of the islands. And I think going to turn the islands into virtual deserts. They're volcanic islands to start with, and I think it would be a tragedy to let the goats continue uncontrolled. So I actually contributed to that campaign and financially, and I'm proud of it because I think it really needed to be done. But when I was there on my second visit, I saw them removing a goat, and it was dead, and they were carrying it off and putting it in a boat to take it to some other island. And I was saddened. I know you can't help but be saddened when you see an animal being killed. And I really appreciate your story of the sharpshooters and the special forms of using Judas goats and so on. It's a fascinating story that I didn't know in detail. I have a question for you, if I may ask now, and that is about tourism. I was there in 87 and 2003, and in that 16-year interval, I saw a dramatic improvement in the city of Puerto Ayoro. I had the impression that the schools, the children, the housing was cleaner, as well as a beautiful, I think it's called a flamboyant tree in the town square. It was so enhanced in that 16 years. I had the feeling that the quality of life for the residents was significantly improved by having tourists pay for those entrance fees. When I went, they were $100. Have they gone up? I gather the fees, and can you tell us a little bit more about tourism and its effects there?
Yeah, certainly I will do that. First to your point about hunting, I think like one of the pieces that I didn't get into in the eradication project, which I also agree with you that the goats were doing an incredible amount of harm, and so something needed to happen. And I think my criticism of it is more about the way that they didn't like consult the local community enough in the way that it was done.
Yeah.
But also these guys that were trained to be sharpshooter conservationist hunters were also kind of traumatized by this experience, because for years they did nothing but kill these animals. And they were like for a while they would let the pregnant females go because they just felt too bad about it, or they didn't want to kill the babies, because that's a hard thing for any human to do, I think. And so then the project leaders had to institute that's part of the reason they did all of this GPS tracking, so that they could keep the hunters accountable for letting, like, if there was a goat that got out, it was on them, right? That they would have to go back to these islands. And so I think there was an emotional toll for people who were doing the hunting as well. Yeah, I would love to have been able to see what the islands looked like in 1983. I made my first visit in 2007, and the islands have developed considerably since I have gone in the last 13 years. But yes, I think that the institution of the $100 came in 1997, and that has done a lot to improve quality of life. And it keeps a lot of the money for the national park actually in the archipelago. So it is not like right at the time, a lot of that money was going to other parks in Ecuador, and now most of it goes to Galapagos. Now it's actually, there's so much in Galapagos that it's also going back out to the other national parks, but in a much better way. But it goes to municipal governments so that they're able to do things like pave the roads and put up nice parks for residents and for tourists. I think, yes, the last I went was early 2020, and it was still a $100 entrance fee.
Okay.
They have been talks recently about increasing it, and I would imagine that will happen in the next couple of years. There have been talks of just doubling it to 200. It's been that low for so long that I think that would be completely reasonable. But there's also talk of, there have been proposals to increase it tenfold to $1,000 or more. And I think that I am not so supportive of, because I think it would, Galapagos tourism is already very elite. It's very expensive. And I think that would really make it so much more so that, like normal upper middle class folks wouldn't be going. And I think it would also really, it's cheaper for people who live in Ecuador and South America. They pay a lesser entrance fee than other foreigners do, but I think it would also start to make it prohibitively expensive for a lot of folks in the island. So I worry about that.
Excellent. I have another couple of quick questions. Did you ever get up to Tower or Genovesa?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I would love to go.
Much as I find tortoises interesting, I find Tower one of the highlights. I didn't go there in the first trip, but that's where the frigate birds breed. And it is just a remarkable place to look at the interaction between a parasitic bird like the frigate bird that cannot, has no oil glands for keeping its feathers water repellent and has to be parasitic on the boobies that are good fishing birds, but quite willingly give up their crop of food because frigate birds are incredibly aerobatic in the air. To watch this display, I imagine there are other places in the world you can do it, but you just see it routinely in front of your eyes all the time on Tower. I think for me, it was one of the, I like birds a lot, and it was one of the most essential enjoyments of the Galapagos. My other question is, did you get into the calderas on Isabella and see the tortoises there?
I wasn't able to do that either. I had several trips with park guards planned that all were scuttled at the last minute for various reasons. They were doing rat eradication. The helicopter we were going to take at one point had no fuel. All of a sudden, like silly things. But no, that was always one of my goals too. When the bird, like one of my favorites is Espanola, and being able to go see the albatross, like do their runways. They need, like these birds need really long runways. They run to be able to take off, and to see the dances that they do. Yeah.
The courting of the parents too is demonstrable there. Yeah, well, you can. I'm sure that you'll go back and how you can.
Sure, I will.
that you missed, because those are essential. I've not myself gone up to a caldera, but if I ever went back, I would love to do that. I think the tortoises there are in a special little. It makes me think of the primitive state of nature to see them, I would imagine, in a caldera. I think that's where they really thrive most, perhaps, and it would be fascinating to visit them there. Well, let's look. I think they have a question from Lee. Is that right, Lee?
Yeah, I was just looking at that.
Let me unmute you, or maybe you can unmute yourself. Can you hear us, Lee?
I can read the question too.
Okay, good.
Well, basically what I'm trying to do is get my mind wrapped around the definition of evolutionary processes. So, is it true that evolutionary processes result in adaptation within a species? For example, you might have a change of color to protect from predators through, kind of a survival of the fittest mechanism. Whereas no evolution to actually change from one species, basically to a completely different kind of animal, like from a reptile to a bird, has ever been observed.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lee. So the first part certainly happens, the adaptations to shifting environments. Sometimes it is about predators. And in the case of the tortoises, that's really what drove the diversification of species. And so that's happened over the last million years. So when the tortoises on the Galapagos are most closely related evolutionarily to tortoise species from the South American continent, and what happened, what we think, no one really knows this for sure, but the genetics work suggests that about 1.2 million years ago, I think, some tortoises from the continent arrived to the Galapagos. It would have been at least one pregnant female tortoise, maybe two, male and female, but they would have drifted probably on rafts made of debris from rivers out to the islands and been lucky enough to actually wash up on shore. They washed up on the easternmost island and repopulated, and then a couple 100,000 years later, those tortoise species would go, and they actually were washed ashore again. Some people think it's because of the El Nino rains, really, like they're so strong in the Galapagos that they will just wash boulders into the sea. And so they think that some of the tortoises would have been washed into the sea, and then they Some of them would have been successful colonizers on a new island. And when they go from island to island, some of the islands are really low and dry and don't have a lot of vegetation. And so the tortoises would adapt slowly to that island environment. And others have, like where we saw with the goats, there's a lot of woody vegetation. And so those tortoises have different morphologies, like they look different. And so there is that kind of adaptation within the species that's going on over, with the case of the tortoises, over a very, very long term, which is part of the reason why conservationists have wanted to go back to this like evolutionary past and kind of erase the brief blip of 500 years of human history in the archipelago. But evolution to change one species to a completely different species, I mean, from reptile to bird to change families like that, I don't know of examples that are like modern examples of that, but you might be interested in the research of Peter and Rosemary Grant, who were ornithologists that were at Princeton. I think they're retired now, but they did really long-term, like 40-year studies on a very small island in Galapagos called Daphne Major, and they were interested in finch evolution. And they have actually seen the evolution of one finch species into a different species of finch in their lifetime. So during the course of this 40-year study. So that the change from one species to another does happen. There's actually a brilliant book about this called The Beak of the Finch by Jonathan Weiner. And I would highly, highly recommend his book if you're interested in that.
I think there's another.
But the point is that you really don't see, that's one species of finch to another species of finch, which, I can wrap my mind around that.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that Darwin really intended, did he intend that, like humans came out of, something that climbed out of the primordial ooze, as the joke goes,
Yeah.
That we went from, a single cell, all the way up through adaptations to the environment to humans finally after millions and millions of years. Is that possible? That's not what Darwin meant, did he?
I mean, I don't know that Darwin wrote about the primordial ooze, so to speak, but he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. And that came out, I think, like 20 years after his Origin of Species, which really didn't mention people at all in this evolutionary world, although it was immediately, the implications for human evolution were kind of deduced from that and made Darwin a kind of pariah, particularly to the church at the time. But he wrote about the descent of man. And so he did write about humans and ancestral relationships to the greater primates. And so, yes, I think he was thinking about human evolution, but over the course of millions of years, right? Not over the course of, like, there were jokes at the time about how Darwin's grandfather must have been an ape. And like, clearly that's a bastardization of what he meant.
I think the iguanas might be a useful model to think about the difference between the land iguanas and the marine iguanas. They're huge, and yet those iguanas probably came over with rafts the way the tortoises did. And it's fascinating to see the difference between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those marine iguanas in Galapagos are the only marine feeding iguana species in the world.
Yeah, and they're adapted to feed off of underwater moss, and whereas the land iguanas, like the opuntia trees, and the opuntia trees in turn adapt by having their fruits just a little higher than the land iguanas and the tortoises can reach, particularly the land iguanas. So this evolution is constantly ongoing on the islands, or not ongoing, but we can see its effects. I have a question about the control. Who makes the ultimate decisions? I would think that the government of Ecuador would be very happy to maintain an active tourist trade, because the tourists come through Quito and stimulate considerably the economy of Quito, as well as Guayaquil on the way home. And so I would think your book would be read with an interest and enthusiasm by the powers that be in Ecuador. Can you tell us a little bit about the authorities and how they decide?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right that the tourism industry is incredibly important for all of Ecuador and not just Galapagos. So every flight that goes out to the archipelago is mandated by the government to stop in either Quito or Guayaquil. So you can't like take a flight directly from Colombia or Peru to Galapagos. And they do that very intentionally so that they get that flight money. Because you have a lot of people who go to see Galapagos and Machu Picchu, but you have to do the conversion on the continent and not just fly from one nation to the other. Yeah, so there are ministries of tourism that are in charge of those kind of laws, and they work with the airline companies to arrange that. The tourism ministry also does the number. There's a certain number of cruise ships that is allowed in the archipelago, and they can have a certain number of beds. And there's a quota system where they have to get. They're called cupos. They have to like get the cupo for the right number of beds on their boats. And so that's how the Ministry of Tourism gains control over the size of the tourism cruise industry. They have much less control over the hotel industry, and what's really it's grown considerably over the last 10 years since I've been going to Galapagos are the number of on-island hotels and the kind of on-island tourism that you can do, which is really good if you live in Galapagos. And most folks who live in Galapagos, there is poverty in the islands, but it's mostly pretty upper middle class. It's a really nice place to live if you're Ecuadorian. It'd be like living in Hawaii would be for us. But because of the tourism industry, I mean, until this year, I think the economy has just completely crashed with the pandemic. But tourism was a very consistent and consistently growing business in Galapagos. And so the government will controls the number of hotels that are established as hotels and how many bedrooms they can have. But what has also grown considerably are like just the number of Airbnbs and homestays that people offer, and the government has much less control over that. And so the tourism ministries are in control of that aspect of things. For like where the cruise ships go, I imagine that you saw a difference between your 83 experience and your 2003 and how controlled that experience was, because like back in the 70s, it used to be you'd like go find a little fishing boat and they would take you and you just kind of make up your itinerary as you go along, and it was really rustic and roughing it, and you could camp on the islands. That doesn't happen anymore. The national park, I think cruise tourism is very well controlled by the national park. Every ship has a set itinerary. They are set such that the cruise ships follow each other around. There's like one master itinerary around the archipelago, and you can take cruises that do the whole thing, which is like a 2-week cycle, or you can do different like 5-day pieces of it. But the ships are routed so that, you know, if I stop at one visitor site for the morning for 2 hours, there'll be 2 other ships there max. And then 2 hours later, when we're out of sight, the next 2 come in. Every 16 people has their own naturalist guide with them at all times when they're not on their ship or in town. So it's really pretty well controlled. The National Park has done a good job with that.
That's great. Yes, I saw that on the second trip in 2003. It was very well controlled. What about the decision with the goats? What level was that decision made?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the goat the national park was the official grantee on all of that. The Darwin Station was part of it as well. The Darwin Station it's an NGO, but it is a really unique legal structure because it is registered as an NGO in Belgium, not in Ecuador. And so it is the official scientific advisor to the state for the Galapagos, but it in the 1960s was completely unique because it gave control to this bunch of foreign scientists who were going to run the Darwin Station, and also because they were much better funded and had larger staff and more scientific training, they were kind of overseers of the national park. And that has changed completely since about the year 2002, when the Darwin Station has been in financial straits for a long time and had some mismanagement problems. And in the meantime, the national park has grown immensely. It has a much larger budget now, much larger staff. And so the national park now is much more in control. There's also a group called the Galapagos Conservancy. If you've been, you probably get their fundraising emails. They are the Washington, D.C. based Friend of Galapagos organization fundraiser that in the United States. There are different ones in Germany and the UK. But they also run a group of, there are two conservation biologists who I work with really closely, and someone who used to work as the head of restoration for the national park, but now works with the Galapagos Consultancy. And they run now what's called the Tortoise Restoration Initiative. And so they were all centrally involved in Project Isabella too, but they kind of have a new structure that is as a consultant with the national park, but not beholden to all of the bureaucracy of the national park either.
But they do integrate pretty well, all these different organizations. Good.
They do, yeah.
Good. I'm glad to hear. Let's see if we have some other questions coming up here.
Yeah, so Rachel says, did you see a potential alternative solution to the invasive goat issue, or mostly that needs to be better and more holistically explored? That's a really good question, because I think that it's really difficult to control these invasive goats, particularly when they are reproducing in areas where people don't live. And so in some ways, I think that the eradication campaign was probably very needed. I do think that politically, what often happens in Galapagos is that you have the Darwin Station of the national park that are in charge of that 97% of the archipelago that is the national park, that is nature. And then you have the 3% where people live that is controlled by the municipal and state government. And those two different systems of government have not worked together very well in the past. And so I think like you have this situation in which the national park, the Darwin stations, outside scientists, consultants feel like they can make decisions for the national park without really talking to anybody in municipal government and local government, like doing community meetings. And so one of the things that there was so much pushback against Project Isabella and the way that the decisions were made. And all of a sudden you have like all of these helicopters with people hunting out of them, and people are very alarmed, right? Like if this happened in your neighborhood, you would want to know what was going on and who said okay for that, right? And so they got a lot of pushback about that. And so since about 2005, they have started doing these, when they do like every 10 years, there's a management plan that is put together for the national park with its scope and its direction for the next 10 years. And they have started doing participatory forums to inform the management plan. And so the first time they did that, it was kind of like they made their management plan and then they shopped it around, and they had community sessions on like listening sessions on the different islands. And people were not very pleased, right? Because it wasn't, they were kind of being informed of what was going on, but they weren't actually being consulted or asked about their priorities or like really consulted in a meaningful way. And so they've gotten a little bit better about that in the subsequent years. I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And I think that, you know, a lot of folks that work for the national park are Galapagos, grew up in the islands. And so they have like their feet in both of these worlds. And I think that it is crucial to start using their expertise, and not only as conservationists, but also as members of the community, to really like help bring people into planning for the national park, and to be explaining like, well, there's a scientific reason why we're going to do it this way. And like, let me help explain why it is that we have to kill all these goats, and not just let them go or kill some of them because that they would repopulate. So I think there's a lot more communication and kind of political strategizing work that needs to be done around the science.
I would think that now that the goats have been eradicated, and perhaps better explained to the public, that some of that stress would be dying down. We're not. I can see it's a provocative title that you have, but I still don't think that we're returning the Galapagos to some ancient Eden. I think far from that. But we're just dealing with a huge issue, single issue of goats, and it has a huge ramification for the vegetation in the islands, and some invasive thorns and raspberries and so on might grow in, but it's a bit extreme. I think I would hope that the population now are getting over it.
Well, I think like the goat issue has kind of died down, but now the bigger issue is rat eradication.
Yeah.
And few people are fans of rats, so in principle, this is going to go over better. But
how are they going to do that?
They have poison that they will only target rodent species, and they basically spray it and kind of drop pellets from helicopters to kind of blanket islands.
Wow.
And there are, on islands where no one lives, they have done this and it's had mixed success. They have to take off some bird species that prey on rodents so that they don't, like they have to remove hawks from some of the islands, and that's a difficult thing to do. But there's an island called Floriana where about only 150 people live today, and it's really very small scale tourism. There are a couple of hotels, there are a couple of restaurants, and that Floriana is the next target for rat eradication. It was supposed to happen this year, actually, but it's been delayed. But the people there are really upset about it because of the way that they haven't been consulted.
I see.
Again, to what they think would be appropriate, but they also are worried about like understandable thing, like what happens if you kill tens of thousands of rats on the islands? It's hot there, the sun is really strong, and it's going to smell, right? Or like the poison is going to get into the water supply. They're being told things like you can't let your cats and dogs outside while this is going on. And so they basically think the tourism industry is going to just die for a year while this is going on, and then hopefully they would be able to regenerate, but there's no kind of public assistance plan for them, or like no economic support for them during that process.
Wow, I was not aware of that at all. Thank you for telling me. Is Floriana, I'm trying to remember if that's the island where they have the post office or where they have all the blue. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's that has a lot of history, a lot of German settlers, I think, there.
Mm-hmm.
The next island over is where the blue-footed boobies are mating, doing a lot of mating. The one east of Floriana, I'm forgetting the name of that one. I hope they're not going to, pardon?
Espanola.
Yes, I hope they're not going to do any rat eradication there.
I don't think that Espanola has a rat problem.
No, good.
I think that one is looking pretty good.
Yeah, that's a serious problem. I was not aware of the rat eradication area at all. So, it's a continuing problem, and definitely we need the local people. They need to be consulted. I wasn't aware of that many people living there in '87, and even in 2003, they sort of steered us away from where people are living quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So we weren't so aware of it. But that's, you really bring it together for us, and I think make us more realistic tourists, those of us who have yet to go. So I thank you for that very much. Any other questions from people out there?
Yeah.
Let's see a hand raised.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I just wanted to respond. I think that once you have apparently trampled on people's rights, even when you remedy the situation, it's sort of a scarring event, and people don't forget and they don't forgive, and it builds up resistance for future changes that might be beneficial.
Good point.
Yeah, it does indeed.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, well, if folks are interested in the book, I have a discount code I can show you.
Oh, great.
Great.
You can order it. This is directly from Yale University Press. If you order from their website, which is yalebooks.com, it's YEOBT, which is Yale Environment, the series on Back's Tortoises. Strange acronym for my book, but I think that still works.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I'm glad I waited until now. I've been looking forward to reading it. Now I think I'll enjoy it all the more.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, and thanks so much for having me today.
It's been a delight. And I welcome you to join us for some. I know you're very busy, but you might find some future topics, and you're most welcome to come and join us for those as well.
Well, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, thank you all and for attending, and I look forward to carrying on, and I'll drop you a line, Elizabeth, when I get your book and have a chance to read it in more detail.
That sounds great.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.